Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 71, Design Deconstruction 3, Mascots and Whip Stitch Script. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Happy Friday to all of you, and happy afternoon, happy evening, wherever you are. I hope you are having a wonderful Friday and a wonderful time out of your day. Hopefully, in joining me today, you'll have some educational value brought to you, because I certainly have some things to talk about that were brought up to me in discussions with erstwhile digitizers in this last week. I know sometimes these design deconstructions, sometimes they're far apart, sometimes they're close together, sometimes I'll have these episodes kind of randomly sprinkled through the rest of these sorts of more prepared versions. A lot of the stuff is more lecture style. This one, we're going to be talking about the nature of a couple different designs that people have asked me about, and I'm going to discuss how I put them together and then show you just a history of designs of mine that kind of have the same shapes, have the same building characteristics, and I'm going to talk about things I do right and things I do wrong. So you're getting a history level version of some of the stuff I've done, because some of this stuff is old. I've had a career that spans a couple decades, so some of my stuff that I've done early on may not be what I would do now. The great thing is, I think in discussion of these embroidery designs and looking at how they're digitized and how they're put together, we can arrive at some different ideas in how to define shape, how to define different kinds of areas and spaces and textures, and especially within the kind of the span of what I'm considering the classic Mascot style. And I'll define that to a degree and talk about what it meant for me and where I saw it, and then what I think that it does to our embroidery, the kind of styles we're talking about that have lots of outlines and sharp points and shapes. And I'll show you a little bit in a minute, but let's talk about that as we get to it. The other thing I'm going to discuss very briefly is I had a monogram piece that I showed some time ago when we were testing the whip stitch, which is really a multi-pass satin stitch. I'll discuss how those are put together. It's something I've talked about before. We were testing this for Embrilliance, and when we were doing that, I did a couple of samples to show people different ways to effectively use these stitches, and I made a piece that has multiple layers of these whip stitch columns in it, and people were curious about how it was made and wanted to talk about that texture and what it meant and how it was put together. So I'm going to show some images of it, some photos of it, and certainly show the file itself and just talk about what that whip stitch or multi-pass satin is, what it does, and things like that. So we'll try and cover both of those. I can't say it'll be a shorter or longer episode. We'll just kind of play it by ear. These design deconstructions are more about the conversation we can have in the comments and about kind of touring through some different designs and looking at how they're put together and discussing that stuff. So with that, let's go ahead and grab some comments and have some people talk about it. By the way, Jeff, you got me. I got you in your live stream last night. I said a joke that got you, but here, I got to bring Jeff up. Jeff said, whip it good. Now I've got that song stuck in everyone's head. Yeah, Devo, by the way. If you didn't know, Devo, whip it, Energy Dome heads. Trust me, go look it up if you don't know what we're talking about here. It's worthwhile to know what Devo is. Anyway, let's go ahead and grab some comments and say hello to everybody. I always like to make this personable and talk to everyone who shows up, and I super appreciate you reciprocators. So let's talk to everybody. Orlando saying hello from Pasadena, Texas. Happy to have you in here. Frank Dunn from the UK. Good evening. Thank you for being here and for sharing. You're always such a great member of the community, and I want you to know that I appreciate it. Mike Muldowney, reciprocator number 1, saying hello to everybody. We have Yosta, after we messed it. I said it correctly all these times, and I messed it up today because I was thinking about Aaron Montgomery. So if you know two other guys, you know what I'm talking about. Yosta saying hi from Sweden. Ramona saying good afternoon all. Digitizer yourself. Mike Muldowney saying what's up all. Happy Friday. So I love everybody talking amongst themselves too. Everybody talk to each other. Jan says hello from Bedford, Texas. Jan, happy to have you in. Jeff again saying hello. John says, hi, Eric. Happy Friday to you. I always wondered what a whip stitch was. After today, I'll finally know. I'm going to be honest with you and say a lot of people have kind of said maybe they do or don't get what whip stitch means. Because when you're talking about whip stitch in hand sewing, you know, we're whipping around the edge of something in construction. But in this case, we were referring to the way it was termed to us by some fashion designers who were using it in applique. And they were calling it a whip stitch. So we called it whip stitch when we were working on Stitch Artist. But you will find that it is also called maybe a multi-pass satin or a multiple satin, in which, and I'll cover this again, when we go across the column in our satin stitch, we actually do much like a bean stitch, and we cover that same stitch path multiple times. Of course, odd numbers because we have to travel forward. Even numbers would mean we end up where we started. But yeah, so whip stitch is that. We will discuss what that is, and I'll show you more as we get going. But yeah, you will know from here on out what that whip stitch is, or what a multi-pass satin or a multiple satin is, a multiple count satin is. Jorita, who's shown some awesome landscapes of her work recently. Hello, everyone from sunny and hot Austin, Texas. Well, we take care. I understand we're in the heat wave too here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's been rough. Justin says, good afternoon, embroidery people. Happy to have Justin Armenta, also of JA Digitizing and Embroidery Nerd here, who educates himself. Carol Wilson says, hey, Eric. Well, hey, Carol. Happy to have you in. And Lori is in. And Mike said, I thought we were friends. We are friends. We are always friends. And then, hey, guys, says Letty Walker, creator, I believe, of the Sippy. Now, here's the other thing I'm going to share with you guys. This is not like official merch that is available, but if you guys know, Letty drew Sippy, the reciprocator logo, and Jeff Fuller of the Embroidery Nerd made this for me. Now, number one, it's got Embroidery Nerd logo. We love that because we love the guys over at Embroidery Nerd. But it also, thank you, Justin Armenta, for drawing this out, has my EC bug, which I can actually put up in the branding here. I don't always remember to stick this back up when I have a chance on my overlays, but check out that upper corner in your image right now, and you'll see it. That's the little EC word bubble, which just happens to be kind of my unofficial logo. I haven't really used it all the time. But it also has Letty's Sippy, the reciprocator. Well, little needle bar guy here who is absolutely giving you a question about whether or not you'd like to embroider today. Well, this is an awesome piece, and I have to say thank you very much to Jeff of Embroidery Nerd. And if you haven't seen the other cool stuff that they've done, for sure, absolutely some cool stuff. If you haven't seen the Nerd Stars, these little PVC patches that they give out when you hashtag their stuff and they pick up your posts, excellent stuff Jeff put out. We had a whole discussion about that on the half. If you're on my YouTube channel or Facebook page, go back and check out the discussion I had with Jeff Fuller on the half this morning, who is sitting in for Aaron Montgomery. So we talked about branding, we talked about embroidery in general, and just about promoting yourself in a really cool way. So very awesome stuff. And we'll grab a couple more comments before we get in. Fran says, hi, y'all, from hot and muggy Southwest Louisiana. Once again, take care, Fran. Sean saying, great to see you. Great to have you in, Sean. Happy to have you there. Jeff says about Justin Armenta, digitizer educator, a guy whose furniture is made of ice. Yeah, out in Arizona for sure. And, oh, by the way, I did not know this. Nerdy the Nerd Star patch glows in the dark. Come on, man. You got to do merch like Jeff. He's doing it right, and I know I need to be making that stuff. Mike says, sippy caps, sippy cups. It all works so good. I know, right? Mike, who has I believe, one of the only sippy caps right now. And like I said, I'm not doing merch yet, but I guess I should since you guys are doing merch for me. All right. So with that, let's start talking about mascots. I'm not going to do a links list today. There's not supplementary material. If you want more material, by all means, we have search my name on Google, and there are articles aplenty. But for today, we're going to walk through some stuff and show you some pictures and go from there. And I think that's really going to be the best way to handle this. I'm going to discuss essentially what I think about logos as they are in this mascot world, kind of what I consider the modern movement of mascots. And I'm going to do this partially via kind of the lens of the mascot for the university here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, because this is the one that not only is it the university from which I graduated, but it is also the first kind of university athletic work that I did exclusively in this new style. Because the thing is, when I first started, and this is very, very early on, first year that I started, mascots didn't have this kind of uniform look. And I think what really happened is, and I don't know this, I'll have to look historically about this. I didn't have time to research it for this. It seems like the NFL kind of led with this new mascot style. And I'm going to bring up a set of images, literally just a Google search on UNM Athletics, because the University of New Mexico brought in this logo in 1999. And in the late 90s, that really kind of described what I consider to be the mascot style everybody does. Now, certainly we can identify it with NFL teams, and I'm actually going to show you some other high school logos that some of them are truthfully downright infringing on NFL teams. And this style has become very common, especially in that space. And I mean, we're talking about 20 years ago now. We're talking about 21 years ago now. So these are logos that have been around for a while, but this style came to define and I think shaped the style of mascots going forward. And it's one that I see people sometimes struggling with in embroidery. So I think I'm just going to bring that up first. Let's go ahead and share the screen. I'm going to add this to the stream, and we'll just show you first the kind of stuff I'm talking about. We'll talk about the historical version first as we go through here. But this version here, if we look at this, this is the version that I remember coming in kind of late 90s. And this, to me, defines the logo style that I find people really kind of struggling with. It is this sharp-edged, kind of heavy outlined. It has the sharp pockets, sharp points, and it tends to be multiple colors and multiple outlines stacked together. And I find that this is the kind of logo that people have some difficulty building. And certainly this piece in general, we've got a bunch of other issues. And I'm actually going to show you one of the pieces that I worked on. I will say that sometimes when you're working with collegiate and athletic stuff like this, that there can be a ton of control that's put on you when you're working on pieces. They may kind of force your hand. And I've got some technical quality issues that I never liked with the Lobos logo as it turned out, even as my own turned out. And I'm actually going to show you a couple of commercial pieces that are out there in the wild right now in stores, truthfully, partially to make you feel better about your own work. But secondarily, to kind of show you what I'm talking about here, this is the initial style. It was a full profile, so it's complete side view. But they often have they have like 3 colors in them, which often reflect the school's colors. And yes, cherry silver with accents of black and white. Cherry and silver are what we kind of call our colors. Those are our official colors for UNM. So it's not surprising to see the cherry and silver represented here. As you can see, as it went further on, we ended up with logos that have this kind of more 3/4 perspective. And certainly the other kind of subset of these is this logo, which you'll see over and over. It's a shield version. And because we often have kind of these front-on shield version logos for different aspect ratios, you'll see this represented in different logos as well, different mascots in the same kind of stance. But if you look at it, we still have some of the same issues. Not necessarily all of them, but some of the same issues. We've got these multiple outlines. We have shadows. And we have a tendency to have these very sharp points and complex shapes that if you try and, say, fill a complex shape like that, you're going to get a lot of travels. If you didn't see last week's episode where I talked about fills and complex shapes with holes, these kind of shapes, if you did the gray in this wolf head as one shape, the amount of incredible traveling and the issues you would have with underlay and trying to get, let's say, these thick and thin lines to turn out could be significant. But like I said, even when we go out to these kind of alternate logo styles, we started out with this really flat profile logo. You end up with this kind of 3/4, which is very similar still, has the same feeling. Once again, as you see in the upper left-hand side of that logo, we've got this kind of stacking of both this colored outline that goes over the entire thing. We have kind of a slab of color. If you really look at how it would be printed, what you're almost seeing is very much like a die-cut sticker. We would have this full slab of color, and on top of it, we're going to drop our accent colors. And the thing is, people can't decide in embroidery pretty frequently which colors they're going to lay on top of others. It usually ends up being an issue with how am I going to make this thing in layers? What goes on top of what? How does that shape up to make these multiple outlines? And it's even in what I would consider a slightly simpler version, when we're looking at this shield, the same thing happens here where we have a continuous kind of field of black between the ears and the eye, like the area around the eyes, the cheeks, and the mouth. And this literally melts into the background of the shield, where these outlines in the shield seem to be the same. So we try and lay really fine details on a black field, and that may work, sometimes may not. You can also see in this kind of, there's another alternate shield, and this, I might be able to get a bigger shot of it. Like I said, this is straight out of Google Images. This alternate version of the shield here with New Mexico, often, I believe I've seen this as a shoulder patch. Same kind of thing. We've got these issues with multiple outlines. And in this one, we even have this issue of breaking the outline of this overall design. And as it breaks down the outline on the right-hand side, we're going to have issues with the multiple color outline, as well as layering with what you can see is this kind of these, what I call that die cut line on the outside of the Lobo logo itself, out on the outside of the wolf. So these things can get really complicated really quickly. And I think that no matter how you address these, it's worthwhile to start thinking in layers. That's the first thing we have to do. We have to start thinking about what's behind what. We have to think about the fact that this isn't print. Quite frankly, though it doesn't look like it would be the main background in this particular piece, I would probably consider that much of the wolf, the background would be the gray in this case. We might do the silver as the background, and because we have these narrow columns that can be split up in this kind of lightning bolt shape along the side of the wolf. And that's the thing. I really, this kind of piece, it lends itself to applications. In fact, I agree. Brian Bailey coming in with a comment on this. I see an applique. No, I see a patch. And I'd say, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, applique is a really great way to handle a lot of this stuff. But when we're forced to use conventional embroidery on it, you do have to decide, how am I getting most of this together? Because the thing is, am I running? And actually, I'm going to go ahead and grab, let me grab my pointer focus so I can show you that. I know it's like an ad for the pointer focus app, but you know, if you ever need to do showing like this, pointer focus really does help. Now I've got my little my little icon tool here so you can see what I'm talking about. We have this decision to make as to, am I putting on satin, black satin stitches to define these areas here, or am I somehow having black involved as a background element so that I'm dropping 2 satins to get this lightning bolt in this gray and white? Or am I doing both? And I mean, the truth of the matter is, there's not a right answer to this. It really happens to be a function of what you can get into the space, how big the space is you're working in, how large the logo is allowed to be, and certainly what kind of materials you're working on. But I think it's worthwhile just to once again point out, this was kind of this movement that came along, I would say late 90s, early aughts. We ended up where a lot of logos started to look like this. They'd have this big slab, there'd be an outline around them, there'd be these sharp shapes that are in them. And of the NFL, I think about, like, I believe it's Philadelphia Eagles logo that started kind of this out. There's more that are like this, certainly, but this concept of the mascot that was this aggressive looking, sharp pointed, multi-outlined piece like this took over all over the place, and some traditional mascots kind of fell out of favor, or at least weren't used nearly as much. And certainly we have like historical mascots that still get used, and we have other types of art, but this is a frequent fixture of mascot art. And despite the fact that it was only new like 20 odd years ago, I think that it still is pretty current. And especially when I'm dealing with like high schools and club football, stuff like that, I've had a lot of this style logo over my career. And if nothing else, it's worthwhile looking at it as an exercise of layering and deciding how we're going to make shapes break apart, really. So with that, let me go ahead and grab my software. I will show you a few, like I said, a historical collection of my mascot work over the years. I'm sure I will be partially embarrassed. We'll start with something really classic, something that isn't in this mold, and I'll just show you how the logos were, at least in my town, up until the point of this kind of logo showing up. And this is one of those logos, one of the classic logos. What we had originally were things that you still see this style on, like letter jacket patches. This is where I still see it a ton, even though, yes, these do come up in other areas. These super classic straight outlines, usually on a fairly filled object. This one, I've done a little bit of carving. You can see that I've done some angular differences. I've got a different angle in the fill that's working for the horns on this piece. And if you're close up, you can see that I actually have carved the ears so that we have the front ridge of each of the ears. I also have a little satin on the nose and in the little eye bags on this devil for the Sandia Prep track and field team. And the thing is, though this is carved, this is very much in the classic style of logos that were all over the place when I first came in. You had big slab of color. They're usually 2 colors so that we can be done in team colors. There's a light and a dark color that's being used. A lot of straight stitch outlining on it. And it's essentially a slab with some defined characteristics on top. So I don't know that we really need to run this through, but, you know, I can go ahead and run it through the simulator so you can see it a little bit. And this particular piece, like I said, I broke it up a little bit. I tried to keep the classic look because they wanted that vintage look. But as you can see, it does have the eyes are separated. There's some carving in the face just to bring it some dimensions. You can see, even as we are not to the outlining yet, you can see where the cheeks, chin, the nose, and the eyes are in this piece because it's got some carving done. And then, of course, all the outlining is one big piece. So, like I said, this is the classic look. Or pieces like this. This is what they call the Eldorado Eagles truckin' eagle, which I think is which is funny. Keep on truckin', if you know what that is. And this was another one of these very classic pieces. And this was revamped, but came directly from their original files that were already decades old by the time I was using them. And once again, super classic, but you'll see that I went ahead and carved this out. So here we've got the tail feathers are carved. I've got a curved fill in the rear leg. There's some feathers that were done on top of it in light density satins. We've got a curved fill in the leg. Once again, some light density satins laying on top of that fill to give you some definition in the feathers. The fist was done out of multiple satins. As you can see, we've got the fingers, palm, and then the thumb. Nice curved fill for the chest and the shirt. And then we've come back and done, once again, curved fills, carved pieces, curved fills, as usual. So satins and curved fills being used quite a bit. And then we've got the beak carved to 2 pieces. And here's the little carved talons, the feet, and the outlining run as you would expect. Like I said, this is the classic style, the stuff that was around before those logos became current. And though they still get used, they are really considered to be vintage. They are not the kind of stuff that was then used for years. And I don't think they provide you with too much difficulty. We're not running multiple color outlines on it. We're not having all of the difficulty of kind of the multiple layers coming together of things that are thick and thin, and you can't tell whether it should be a fill or a satin stitch. These are pretty classic. Whether you're talking about the old school San Diego Prep Devil, whether you're talking about the Eldorado Truck and Eagle, it's not that difficult. We have a question from Carol here, and I'll bring this in. Is carving having the fill run in a direction to what's next to it? It's also breaking it up. Instead of, when I refer to carving, I could have technically run the entirety of this white in a big fill. And the first logo that I was presented with for this piece was 2 fills, a satin here, and a little bitty fill over for the hand, and that's it. And the fills were usually straight horizontal or 45-degree angles. They were not changed in angles. So the things that I consider interesting for dimension in this case, no matter how you're doing it, for carving, what I mean is you take an area that could be a flat fill, probably more likely what we have here, where we have a big flat fill that you could just fill out and draw some details on top of. And instead of having one big area of fill, we separate individual items like the horns on this devil, the ears. They are separate objects if they were real. We separate these items and use different stitch types. So we can use satin stitches to determine something that's cylindrical. If something is narrow and tall, if it has that kind of aspect, fingers on your hand, the edge of that ear, the lips, the nose. We can use satins to define those. And you're right, having different angles next to each other. If we were doing, say, the bridge of the nose and then the nose, we could have different stitch angles to define these 2 things from each other, very much as you would see in text where you have a serif and a stem, and that causes there to be a little highlight and shadow that's different on the horizontal satin than the vertical satin. We're doing the same thing here. And that's where you're going to see in the eagle. If you haven't seen, I believe it's about 2 episodes ago where I covered eagles and wings and all of that stuff. I talked about how to carve wings out of individual satin stitches. That is carving in that case. But yeah, when I talk about carving, that's what I'm talking about, is separating areas that could be one big fill into multiple discrete elements that touch, that overlap, and using not only stitch types, different textures, so fill versus satin, so something smooth versus something rougher, or even you could use a randomized fill to end up with an organic kind of feeling next to each other so that they contrast. But you are correct, using contrasting stitch angles, something we'll actually talk about when we're dealing with the whip stitches in a minute here as well. But yeah, so Carol, good question. So that's what I mean when I say carving. Yeah. And not, we take for granted the way we discuss our embroidery. But there are multiple kinds of logos. The thing is, this is kind of where we ended up in the second generation of these logos once that stuff happened. And this is much more like what we're talking about. I mean, we have all these intermediate steps. We'll have a simple logo, but the simple logo still has that same kind of outlined feel. It has the sharp points. It has some of those shapes. There are classic logos like this, where this is definitely a outlined edged logo that has that kind of hand-drawn feeling. But over time, it ended up being consistently outlined. It ended up having a consistent second color outline on it that still kind of apes this look of these more modern logos that have that. They almost always have this thick outline on them. So even though this is a very classic logo, you'll see, number one, did I do some carving? Absolutely, I did. And I can show you that. Certainly, I'll show you that, by the way, the outline on this one was put on before the fills. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the reveal. But in this case, did I carve it? Yeah, absolutely. The different elements in the tail, the individual legs were carved with 2 different curved fills that are curved differently. and hand, stomach. Here is the randomized kind of length limited satin. And then you can see ears, face, and we've built up the mouth. So even in just the purple here on this royal purple line, you can see that I've done some work to get dimension out of it. So still a classical logo, but I've done some single color carving in order to define it. Thing is, this still, in my mind, is not quite what we're looking at. What is interesting about it is, even though this is a classic logo, what we do have are these outlines where you're trying to figure out, what am I going to do to get these two color outlines that look a certain way? And in this case, I have often on these logos elected to have the outermost outline run before an inner outline. And this is a technique I use quite a lot. It's in order to kind of control the reveal, but make sure that I don't have any gapping, any areas where we don't fill in very nicely. I like to put that outline that's further in the background all the way to the back because it isn't defining, and I want to be able to define things like sharp points, little voids, things that are on top of that outline in detail. And if I'm doing that kind of work, I often don't want to have to define a super thin outline out here. The other thing is what I discussed earlier, the reveal. What I mean by the reveal is when I have an outline like this and another outline is on top of it further out, I've got the outline that's coming to the foreground. In this case, it's the black. And underneath it, we can imagine I have that satin stitch that is defining the white. Well, it goes further in. It is overlapped by the black. And I can control how thick and thin that is up to the point of not having a line as thick as I would need in satin stitch to make it run. I can have a reveal that is less than the width I would usually use a satin stitch to do it without having to make super tiny fine satin stitches. Because I've got that overlap, I'm just allowing a certain amount of that lower white outline to show, and it allows me to make a finer outline on the outside edge without the difficulty of a super tiny, super thin satin stitch. So the reveal is having that little amount of outline revealed outside of the upper outline, the outline that goes on top. And I know that may sound a little crazy when you're talking about reveal and anything else that you can talk about, like cutting elements and having a little bit that sticks out. All you have to really imagine is I'm going to worry about how much I have revealed here. You have to have at least a millimeter. Thing is, as we all know with pull, if you try and do these little bitty millimeter satin stitches, you might end up with other issues. You might end up with some sort of density buildup in tiny mitered corners. You might end up where this wavers too much and you have difficulty with it, or it slips off or feathers in. But if you have a nice full 2+ mil satin stitch, but then we have another one that grabs on top, as the two pull together, we kind of judge and use pull compensation and underlay to control how much they pull apart, how much they sink in, and we end up with the amount of width and reveal that we want. And hopefully, I believe I can show you that. I believe I've got an image of this one that I can show you stitched out, but that does then lend itself to that overall mascot look. I will say, like I said before, this is not necessarily that mascot style, but the multiple outline thing that we're dealing with does reveal itself here. Haha. It does show itself in this type of logo. And anytime that you need to have that kind of outer outline, you want to think about that sequence, about that order. And I'll also say, frequently enough, when I'm doing straight stitch outlining, I still like to do this where I have that other outline out there and I drop it in, because you end up where if you have two satins, you can sometimes get kind of a ditch between them, and you can drop your straight stitch outline in there and you can get a kind of a fine defined line that tracks the way you want it to. So I often like to do this building where I will have the overall outline under everything and have it nice and thick, so that even if there's a little bit of shifting, especially in difficult garments, lots of these were done on heavy sweatshirts, on things that shift, on things that sink, that I can have that big outline, throw the fill on top of that, throw the detail on top of that, and let it pull apart a little bit, and then drop my final outline right in that trough where the filled area and the initial white outline meet, or even having that white outline completely first and running the other stuff in the middle after it. So yeah, there's different ways we can handle that, but that reveal is something that certainly comes into play on a lot of my logos. Certainly it's not every logo. Some of them will not have it, but you'll see it here. And this is, like I said, kind of like a second generation, almost more like that 3/4 view we saw in the Lobos logo. This logo has that same kind of construction. Let's go ahead and bring it up and I'll run you through it. And I'll be honest, I didn't run myself through all of these before we started. So I'm sure that I'll come to things that I did in quick production that are not what I would teach you now. But if you see, it is a similar kind of thought. In this case, I filled more of the inside first. Usually I would want to do that to stabilize the material and work from the inside out. I have a tendency to do that in general. And this is a later piece than the other piece. But we went ahead and filled in first. But you'll see I did go ahead and drop some of that white outline in. And this is the inner white outline. And then I dropped the outer white outline. And you can see we've got some construction issues here. What I'm going to tell you is I used a single width line to put this in, a single column entry. I would not do that now because it's a little too dense in the overlaps. You can see it up in these little corners. It overlaps too much, especially at the width that it was done. Did it work? Yes, it worked. In this case, I probably wouldn't do that now. And yeah, by the way, Lisa says, hey, there's an E in the eagle. Yep, El Dorado Eagles. So the hidden E is part of the functions and features. So here's that outline laid out first. As you can see, I'm going to do the reveal trick. And you'll see that I have a very, very small overlap in this orange. And what it means is when the orange and the white start to pull apart and they're almost not touching anymore, I'm going to lay the black down in the center in the trough. So watch as we finish through the piece. So we have the orange there. We have this orange here. Then we have the orange fill that's going to make up the hidden E, if you want to call it hidden. And then we have the stitching that's around it. We have a nice little satin stitch that borders it and gives it some definition. And then we start into the black run. So a lot of these things happen before the outlining is defined. But as you can see, there's a fair amount of coverage here. I'm allowing for a lot of it. Once again, this stuff was going on super shifty material. It was okay for it to be a little bit dense. I'm going to say right now, there's some things I would absolutely change about this logo today with the much more stitch conscious attitude I take toward embroidery in my current life. But what I will say is being able to lay that border down into what I consider the trough where that larger logo starts to pull or that larger outline starts to pull, laying that into the trough means I didn't have a lot of registration problems. So I built it out that way in specific to do that. Also, I get to do all this definition work at the end. Now, these certainly are separated, so I jumped into those, and I had the final outlines on the E and on the two strokes that are in the middle, kind of free floating. So as you can see, the way I've built is very similar, and I've used that reveal method. Is this the only way? Absolutely not. If you wanted to, you could totally build this thing up from the inside out, have the black run, and then come back and do the white as this final piece. The other thing you're going to find, though, is that what have I done here? I only have 3 color changes. The white's all running together. The orange is all running together. The black's all running together. So you have to also remember that some of these choices are technical. They're made for the look of the piece. They're made to help it run. I think that running in this fashion does have a tendency, at least in my book, to help you with some registration issues you might have because you've got a nice firm connection where the white layers are very nearly touching all the way around and the white and orange are either touching or very nearly touching. So that if there's a little bit of shift in the final piece of the run, you don't end up with other issues with that. You don't end up with any sort of registration problems. But you also have to look at this as a production standpoint. Running tons of these and knowing that I'd be running them until doomsday, well, that's something where I would want to try and keep my color changes, of course, blocked up. Like I said, in this one, the one big mistake I made, in my laziness of not wanting to draw the individual pieces, I used a single column entry satin around the outside, a satin border. And in this case, the super deep insets that we're seeing here cause that to act a little weird. If I were doing this again today, I would absolutely take some of those out, and I wouldn't do that border in that fashion. Like I said, I like to show you guys the raw stuff. This is stuff that came off my production line. Did it run and look good? Yes. If I were doing it again today with my mind toward efficiency, I think that this loop that's here in the beak, I would absolutely separate that off and do a satin stitch just across or even fill that maybe. Very likely just a satin that I'd break loose of these pieces. And absolutely in this back edge, I would not use that center line underlay, that center single line definition, and I would control these overlaps and these miters myself. I would very much use a two-sided entry so that I could do that without the density that's in it, because I would say that's too much density. In fact, I'll even out myself here and show the density map and say yes. Though I would say satin on satin, really, you can see most of it is not a big problem. Right here where that automatic piece was, I can tell you for sure is a little too much. Just because it shows red doesn't mean it's the end of the world. Satin on satin, it's not going to cause you a lot of three-dimensional density problems. But I will say up in here, absolutely too dense. And this piece run on, like I said, heavy, super heavy knit sweatshirts. I let this thing be a little heavy, but it is too heavy for my tastes these days. And you can see that allowing it to automatically track and handle that piece really up in here has made a problem. So in this case, I would definitely redefine this and use columns myself. I would use two-sided columns so I could define that piece myself. Though I would say, in honesty, the way I ran this piece and having run this piece myself on multi-head machines, it didn't show me any trouble, really. I didn't have any issues. I do think this is too dense, and I would revise it if I was doing it again today. So, like I said, historical walk through some of my work, folks. This is rather an old piece too, Thoreau Hawks. In this case, this one does have the outer border just defined in the color, but as you can see, it doesn't have a third color border. It doesn't have a fully realized border outside of it. This is a very old piece of mine. But what I'll say is you can still see some of the carving. I have decided to use a length limited satin to give it some texture in the chest. There are satins being used to carve out the beak. And then we've got a nice curved fill doing the work for the most of the back. And I'll say the simplicity of the art made it harder to find much else to do with it unless I was going to add some texture maybe to the back of the hawk. But you'll see also kind of that brow ridge is defined as well. So I still think that's interesting just to call out that kind of definition. And we've got a satin, link limited satin, of course, for this kind of crescent moon shape that's on the top there. And then the rest of the definition is done in satins. And though you do at least get to see how it is broken up into several satin elements. And once again, I've used a single width on the outside here. But the thing is, single width entry on this piece that doesn't have a lot of incredible insets, this worked just fine. And I can see using a satin border or single line entry for that just out of expediency. Though, as you can see, I had to stop and break it up so I could drop in and put the T on the back of the hawk for throw. And I handled that without having a trim. And so you can see, again, this piece has 0 trims aside from jumping out to the text. So once again, production friendliness is part of this. Certainly dimension is part of this that we're looking at. We're getting our detail in. We're doing some single color carving before we get to the rest of it. But overall, you can see this is not quite the same detail. This is an intermediate logo that doesn't have quite that much. What I will say, though, is all of these swoops, these sharp points that things come to, they all kind of come out of that same style, that same mascot style that really kind of took over. We've seen the Monzano piece, but let's go ahead and look at, this is a little earlier version, and it was smaller, so it didn't have nearly as much detail. As we can see, it's a pretty small little guy, not a big piece. It's about, it's but a little over an inch tall. It's not quite much more than that. So it's a really small piece, hence why the details look a little muddy. When it's run, of course, things pull in. It looks a little better than that. And this is, of course, a compensated stitch file. However, we can still see that same kind of construction ethos. I'm filling the inside of this piece. So we have the white fill that's initially done. As you can see again, we're going to go ahead and run that outline. And then we run this orange. The one thing you'll see here when we're building negative space, and let's go ahead and look at the entire piece again. Fairly frequently, I'll see people trying to build colors on top, and they have these little stitches. Now, you won't see it as much in this piece because of the compensation that's on it, but there are little kind of divots here. There are sharp lines that come up from, that are the white, that go into what is this orange kind of back of each of these feathers. The thing is, rather than trying to define them on top, I'm using the fact that these satins are going to pull apart to give me very fine lines of white that will appear between the satins. You'll see that the fill actually goes underneath that. So the fill goes underneath those satins enough that in a couple of these areas where they're just barely touching, they're going to pull apart and allow for very fine lines. So we're defining those fine lines in the white, those fine little kind of tapered pieces that are in there, those little tapered bits. We're defining those through using negative space. We're not going to draw those on. We're going to allow those to show up from the negative space between these orange pieces. Now, you'll also see in chasing some texture on this one to make it a little more interesting, I've used overlapped satins to create the fills in the background. Could I have used fills there? Yes. I think for my money, I didn't like the way it was looking. I wanted it to have a little bit of texture, and this allowed the light to kind of travel over the shadows and highlights of those satins, and it gave it kind of a faceted look, which I found to be a better look than just two flat fills smashed together. Not to mention, we're talking about trying to get those little reveals. As you can see, these little satins that are together, and this line will allow that really tiny kind of fingernail pairing of a very kind of smoothed out and tapering line. That's not going to be as easy to achieve if I'm trying to build this out of fill. If I try and build this out of fills, I'm going to have these individual pieces that we're going to travel in and back out of and have to try and set one stitch angle or a curved angle that hits all of these and allows that kind of pull to always be in the angle that I want it to be, that's going to allow that negative space reveal. Well, and in this case, I mean, it's revealing it by pulling away, and below that, the white stitching is still there as it runs narrower. In any case, this really is not easy to do with complex fills, and with a complex fill in a small spot, we're going to see a lot of traveling, and we're not going to get that kind of definition. So both we're getting the textural definition of the layered satins, and we're getting the ability to make fine lines and to then produce that negative space that I talked about earlier. So as we can see, once again, you'll see I've carved the beak out of two pieces of satin so that the inner part of the beak looks separate. You're going to see that I'll actually define the dark kind of inner part of the beak on top of that, but you'll see that the back of the beak that's furthest away from you is defined as a separate satin piece than the front, so that those two satins layer up, and it does look more like the open back half of the beak is away from you, is further behind the picture plane, further back in the picture plane than the front. So we've got that carving down, and then we'll see the eyes, nose, and the detail come in. As that comes in, of course, it defines the rest of the piece. And of course, we do have the inside of the beak attached to this, but you'll see that the background area, the outline that defines the back of the beak, is literally under this top portion and therefore looks further behind. We're using overlapping as well. So we'll run through it one more time just to kind of show the structure. Like I said, there's multiple ways to do this. You totally could change your order. You totally could outline last if you want to. For me, this structure was a little more bulletproof as it came to things shifting on machines. And that's just the way I learned to handle it. Once again, totally could use something different. In this case, because we're getting so small, we might end up getting close to our limits on how small satin stitches are going to run well if we did try and make that reveal that small. Because if you look at the reveal that's out here, we can measure it. We're probably close to 1 millimeter, but probably not much more. So if I go ahead and grab a measurement tool here, take a look at it, and what we're going to see is we're a little bit more than that. We're like 1.5. So I think that's it's a nice healthy reveal. But as you can see, yes, it's 1.5 mils, but I got to run it at more, almost closer to, I would say, 2.5, almost 3 in some spots. And that gave me a nice, healthy satin stitch that's not going to sink and not going to cause me any sort of trouble. And once again, as we have the fill and the satin stitch, or two different satins pulling apart, we get kind of that trough that we can lay our top outline into. So let's go ahead and look at some other logos and stuff, and then I'll show you some images as well. I think that it's interesting to kind of just look at these things, run through them, and then we can look at some other images of the actual stitched out pieces. I'm going to show you these. This one's a tough one. Really, really small version of that Lobo logo. Looks pretty awful, but once again, this thing is teeny tiny. It was 1/4 of 4 logos that went on a sleeve, but you can still kind of see how it's built. Unfortunately, on screen, we're not getting quite a big difference between the silver and the white to show you, but this one actually has fill underneath it because it's so small that trying to make some of the small satins really didn't work as well. So in this case, we're using a fill underneath it. We're going to go ahead and define the red, and then we're going to put the satins on top. Satins on top being defined the way they are certainly have a little bit of extra underlay on them that maybe could be gotten rid of. But you can still see that we're allowing, instead of drawing in each one of these gray areas, we're allowing some negative space reveal to give us really thin lines and sharp points that we might otherwise have issues with. And same thing here, we're allowing the black here in this satin stitch. We're defining the inside of the mouth, but as you'll see, we're using literally sometimes a single stitch, a couple of stitches to define the area between the teeth. And we're putting it on top of the white teeth. It's not dimensionally what you would want, but when you're at small sizes, you may do that in order to get those fine definitions. I still have these individually carved teeth, as you can see, They are made of individual satin stitches, so you still get a little bit of dimension to them, but you are going to see that instead of just outlining, I've used the satin in the mouth to kind of help to define those teeth and then outlined around the outside edge. And once again, we're dropping outlines and details kind of into the trough. The thing is the outline doesn't go all the way around. So instead, I'm connecting around the other details that are present in the piece, because the back, of course, does not have the outline all the way around. But it is a very similar method of building where I'm using that outer outline and revealing it. And once again, you're going to see no repeated color changes in this piece. So when it was produced, mass-produced, we weren't doing a lot of extra color changing. Here's that shield, and I'm going to say I've never loved this shield. So this is one of my least favorite pieces. I'll show it to you anyway. We do have a couple of holes where we have absolutely thick fills that are in the final piece. You can see there's a fill in the forehead of the logo. There's a small fill in the nose. Well, let's go ahead and see that we do have a big plate fill that starts out, but we do have a complex fill where the inner portion of it, where it's underneath those filled areas, is chopped out a bit. Satin overfill, I usually won't do any cutting out like that, but fill overfill, I definitely want to do that. So we'll run through that in the show that we've got that background in. We're going to go ahead and run the outer logo outline. And then you're going to see the gray all run out carved. And as you can see, once again, when we're defining really thin elements, we've broken them out into satin stitches, turning satins, both for that texture, both for that shine, and rather than having them part of an overall fill. Once again, you can see that there's carving being done here. The fur on the sides of the face, the cheeks could be done as fills, but we'd have all of that kind of traveling going in and out. In this case, doing them as layered satins from the back to the front also gives you some dimension. And you can see that we've finished up all in one color change once again. So we only have one jump in that particular piece. Go into the red for the text. In this case, big fills on that text that look really big and slobby. Why do they look like that? Because we're going to put all sorts of little outlines around them. This is why I hate this piece. Every once in a while, you get your hand forced on things. This is one of the ones that I absolutely did not like. We defined all of the white on top. We did allow the black to be generally the background in this case. Honestly, one of the other reasons we did that, though fill was used in this particular piece, a lot of the other pieces would have applique underneath them or be on black substrates, and we wouldn't use that fill at all. So in that case, kind of having this as a multi-use piece made sense to do it that way. We can see, once again, I'm dropping that on the top, and I'm leaving a gap because we have a border that's in between these two. I'm just allowing that fill to remain there as that gap border. But then these outlines are what I hate. I connected them as much as I could, but some of them had to have trims. Did they actually look okay in the final piece? Kind of, but you can still see they're using a very similar piece to this on their current gear, and it doesn't look awesome. So this is another one of those ones where I'm not a super fan, but you can still see kind of how we've used satins to narrow up to define it, how you've used negative space to define certain areas, and certainly how we're laying in that final outline that's further forward and allowing what I called kind of that sticker die cut outline to be further backward. Like I said, you could totally do it differently. In this case, what you can see is that we have what I would call kind of inclusions or something, kind of these areas where the white outline is coming into the outer outline. If I were running this outline last, I'd have to be going thick and thin all over the place because we have a nice big thick shadowed outline on the bottom, but we have a thinner outline in other areas of the logo, and we have these areas where this inner sharp outline is supposed to be on top of it as far as the art is concerned. So in this case, the art is almost dictating to us, well, not almost, it's really dictating to us that that white outline is furthest forward and is closest to us in the picture plane. We'll go over a couple more, but I think after that, we'll go ahead and I'll show you some pictures, and then we'll get on to the whip stitch, since I know that is the other big question I had for this week. So this is another one that I thought of as transitional. This Hawks football, once again, a small sleeve logo, small left chest at times. At least that's how it was used. And in this case, not exactly with that multiple outline, but what I wanted to show you is I did something similar in outlining the head with fine lines here. These are straight stitch lines, and we have a little star that defines the iris of the eye. But we've done that same thing where I've done a fill and I've laid that outline in a ditch. Not in quite the same way, but you'll see as we go through it. Number one, we did a little bit of a global underlay, just an outline in this case, instead of centering out to kind of tack down the material. I've carved out wings. You can see we've got those satins, same thing in the talons. We've got some satins throughout here. And so here we are once again in the back wing, which is going before the body. So once again, we're doing our layering. Here's our wing edge. There's the second layer of the wing. There's that kind of leading edge of that shoulder. And in this case, we did the body afterward. And then we layered on top the inner fill of the head. So the white that's in the head is layered on top. And then we're doing the gray outline. So the gray outline on the outer portion, it is a little thin, but in this case, I was also having to use it, as you can see in the center, to define the back wing separation. And once again, I didn't really want to run this multiple times when I didn't have to. The hawk, often it was used on its own as a motif, which you can kind of see the genesis of that as we keep going. But here we are with the rest of the outlines that were done in separate satin pieces instead of single columns. And once we have that laid out, you can see that in the actual hawk's head, and I'll go ahead and try and zoom in on that a little bit as we're running it. In the hawk's head, once we have these gray outlines run, I'm laying down the individual stitches of this line. Those are all going to drop into that trough. They're just on top of the outermost outline. As we can kind of see, they're just on top of it. They're just a little bit over to account for the pull that's going to happen in this outer outline, but they drop into that trough, into that kind of gap almost. There isn't really a gap, but into that area where the two colors meet. And it really does kind of line up nicely and look very clean. So that's how we did it. We can account for our pull very well that way, and that's an easy way to handle it. Certainly it is slightly different because you can see that I didn't run that other outline first before I did some of the inner material. I went ahead and ran it. In this case, it worked pretty well, and I don't feel particularly like it was a problem doing that. It is a little different than the other Mascot setups, but I'm still doing that idea of the final outline laying into that trough, as I call it. And I've found that that's been a pretty useful thing for me to try and guide that outline exactly how I want it to be. Here's one of the here's the thing too. The Eldorado Eagle went through several redesigns, and this is the one that I did because it was infringing. It was actually given a cease and desist because they were originally using, I believe, maybe Seattle Seahawks. Can't remember which one of the NFL logos that they were clipping, but yeah, they were definitely using one. And when they had some issues with selling garments that had that on it, we did some redesigns. Here's another one of them, but built a very similar way. Here's our general fill. Beak built out in the same fashion. We have, I would call these much nicer overlapped satins, and you can see how those fine points are going to allow for that negative space of these little fine darts of white to appear. And those go on top of the fill just a little bit. Where they're completely fully overlapped, you'll see that fill ceases to be in that area. It doesn't need to be, but it is in the places where there'll be a little bit of a reveal between. Then we have the orange outline. Then we start filling in those black details. And again, we're laying that into the trough. These are, once again, those are individual two-side entry satins that are being used both for the definition of the inner points and for the outline. And you can see I'm actually layering those out to try and make this look a little more dimensional. So once again, that's that same kind of look. That's what we're looking at. Like I said, there's other things we can talk about. There's plenty of little eagle concepts. There's a million of these things. This bear is another similar one that I've seen, a lot of like two bold colors with an outline. This one doesn't have to have that problem because it doesn't have the double satin outline. So the fills can run right up into the edge pretty simply. So in this case, we're just, and you can see that I've used a fill for the lettering and then used negative space. The lettering was kind of small. The outline didn't look really great. So I went ahead and did that. This is a very early piece of mine. And you can see we've done the two fills that are here, and I actually ran those before the outside edge. Now this is run this way for one other reason, because on black garments, the outer outline was actually run separately as a different color. That was part of their colorway, but this is what I would consider intermediate. It's not like the ones that usually, like I said, in a more modern version of this thing, it would most definitely have one more outline on it of a lighter color on the outside edge, almost assuredly. It wouldn't be done quite this way. This was in that kind of intermediate time. So like I said, there's all kinds of ways to do it. This is another one, Rams. This one doesn't have the double outlining. So once again, you'll see that I'm going to lay that outline last in most of these, but you will see that because we have the double outline up here on the text, I did go ahead and do it in that reveal manner. So once again, really just depends on how I'm trying to lay that final outline in. In this case, with the Rams, the Ram itself, I went ahead and put it on after everything else. But in the case of the text with that double outline, I used the reveal to help me kind of control the issues with how much outline I was getting as I was testing. Same kind of thing. Last one here is my other alma mater, my original high school, Del Norte High School. And this was the Knights logo from Del Norte, one of the very small versions of it. But it was once again, the redesign that happened in that same kind of time period. So you can see the fill here. We've got 3 different fills with different angles. So I'm carving a little bit. We've got that central little button for the hinge on the faceplate. Then you've got kind of the feathers behind. We have that crest. And as you see, the spray of feathers that comes out of the helmet at the hinge, well, that's going to be 3 carved satins to give it some texture and have it go above that fill. Then we have that outer outline again. And then we're laying in details and laying this inner outline into the ditch, into that trough. Same kind of activity. And once again, only jumps between elements that are not attached. I could have absolutely attached this to the front of the visor, and I should have. But other than that, you don't have a lot of jumps and you don't have repetitive color changes. So hopefully that was helpful for the mascot thing. Hopefully that made sense to you guys. I think that helps to kind of show how these are built. Somebody was asking about mascots. Personally, I had some questions, and then I also had somebody show up in one of the stitch artist groups who was talking about mascots and discussing how they were built, and they were just layering fill on top of fill. And I wanted to show some different versions of how we might break those shapes up and use satin stitches to define different areas, very much like the backs of those eagle wings. Let me go ahead and grab, let's see if I can grab one other thing here. Hopefully I've got my stuff here. If I can give you my other stuff that I didn't have on the screen correctly, apparently. Here we are. Here's a mascot style album. I was just going to show you a couple other mascots and some of those pieces that we saw. Here's that actual Del Norte Knight. So kind of a poor picture. And what I'm also going to tell you is this is from the what I call the wall of shame, where my operators used to tack up all of their first samples, and sometimes they didn't run really well. This particular one, I actually changed a little bit about the fill, because you can see this kind of, I think this came out a little rough. So we worked on that reveal, but you can see as it narrows in how nicely those 2 outlines kind of feather in together, because they match the same angle as they go through. What looks like a thick kind of clumsy outline on top becomes a nice thin defined outline. And I think that's something to look at. We know when we have stitch angles that match, whenever we have stitch angles that match, that the threads are going to kind of feather together, the stitch is going to feather together, and we'll have a thinning as it pulls more than you would have if the angles were opposed. And I think that you can use that to your advantage on these outlines like this, because you can put what looks like a fairly heavy outline and let it sink into that outer outline, and we get a fine, nice defined line like this that I find looks very attractive. It looks kind of very molded and actually quite patch-like in its appearance, which I think is really part of what we were looking for. So I thought that would be interesting to show you guys. Certainly there's other types of mascots that we're seeing. This is like one of the old transitional mascots where you started to get these slabs of color, and on top of the slabs of color, we ended up doing some defined work. This is one of my really old La Cueva Bears logos that I had done. So once again, we're still looking at kind of the sharp lines and that definition and that thick outline style, but this is definitely a different kind of piece. And I honestly, once again, these days I put a nice satin around that background border. You guys have seen the St. Pius piece that I've shown you here many times, the winged lion. As you can see, this is a later piece of mine. Didn't have the double outlining, but I think even in this kind of, to tell you the truth, this reject piece, you can see how I've used negative space to let this tooth show through. This mouth area was defined as part of the final outline that was done on it. So negative space is still there. You can see the carving in the wings and the body, something we've talked about many times. But certainly the classic style still comes out. This is one I did for an arena football league, where it's got shading and it's a very classic cartoon style logo with the fine lines. They still exist. You will always seem to find, though, sharp points. I think it's just the aggressiveness of the logo, where after that kind of era of these heavy outlines and sharp points there, everything has swoops, sharp points, fine kind of gradated teeth on it. It seems like that's just very common. Another view of that, the St. Pius logo. Once again, I think that's transitional, looks almost more like a vintage logo, but you can see how we've used some, like I said, especially, like I said, the negative space in the tooth is, I think, interesting there. Though that's a satin that is carved in that space, the negative space in the mouth really kind of cleans up and defines that tooth. Another old school one, La Cueva Soccer, very much in the more classic method, but you can still see this was that transition between those styles, between the classic style and what I consider kind of the modern style. And here are the two pieces that are made to make you feel better. These are straight out of our local Target. That is a logo on a hat being sold in the store today. If you ever feel like your designs are too muddy or too rough, yes, that's a small logo on a hat, and I'll give them some credit there, but you can say to yourself, hey, there are pieces being sold that people are happy to pay a great deal of money for that are not super perfect, super clean. And here is a version of that shield. And I'm going to tell you, it was pushed to its limits. Very obviously, it looks similar to mine, but isn't mine. I can tell from the way that these carvings are done. I know sometimes I can find one of my old logos still floating around. This is not one of them. But you can see the desire to try and put that two-color beveled outline on this thing at this size is just a poor idea. If they would simplify this thing, they'd be a lot happier. But this is being sold in the stores as is. So if you ever criticize yourself too much, recognize that you are not alone in having issues sometimes with your embroidery. And frankly, these things are being put out in the stores. And I'm looking at my ancient piece from Liquavi here that I hate. And I'd say it looks better than the Lobos pieces I was showing you right there. And this piece right here, no lie, was done in that QDT software that I'm always telling you about. Had no ability to draw real curves. Didn't have any tools beyond individual lines. I had to make all the curves out of small individual straight stitch sections, and it didn't have a lot of the automation we have now. So if I can do that in that software, I think they probably could have maybe done some stuff here, but it requires you to do some redesigning, and it requires you to do some thought, because this logo here is not particularly far from the size of this logo here. So yes, you can achieve it, but I think you have to think about how your layers are running. You have to think about certainly how things are going to pull, and absolutely have to test and rework things. So, hey, and I thought the other fun thing was you guys have seen the wall of shame before, but I can actually zoom in on the wall of shame and we can show you a couple of those logos are up there. If you ever wondered, yeah, there are some of the mascot pieces in this piece. And funny thing is I've had people call me up and say, oh yeah, look, there's some of the winged lions are in there. Oh, there's New Mexico Lobos hockey. There it is. And you can see my outlines are a little cleaner, but that was a much larger piece, I would say. So we have some of those mascots are showing up in this piece. So if you've ever wondered what's all up here, well, there's some of that material that I show you is on the old wall of shame. I'm sure this far down the line, hopefully they've gotten rid of some of these pieces, but I know because some of this stuff was the fun movie stuff that we did and all the rest of it, they really loved that. Some of it's probably still up there now, but there's your Del Norte in multiple colors as well, working well on multiple backgrounds. There's Lobos hockey in the same shield shape as well. So yeah, fun stuff. Like to do logos, but logos can present some individual difficulties that are hard for folks. With that, let me go ahead and grab quickly, because we've gone so far in, I still want to talk about whip stitches real quick. I think I'm going to do it fairly quickly, but I'm going to bring up the file first, give you a chance to kind of see what we're looking at here. Hopefully that will be what we can get to. We'll get a little bit to whip stitches. We might actually have to cover it in a second run. But let's go. Actually, first thing, let's bring up the some of the sampling files. I'm going to show you this first. The piece that people have been asking the most about, it's these two pieces, and actually are two pieces. The first one is this one. As you can see, it is a nice big monogram E that has some texture to it. You see that this texture looks very much like thick thread, but it's not. It's actually a matte finish 40 weight thread. So this is actually like a spun polyester 40 weight thread. It is not a big, thick, heavy thread. So though this looks like it's a big, thick, heavy thread, it absolutely is not. This is done with stitches. The first thing to say is that whip stitches or multi-pass satins are often used to give you the texture of that. So, and this is part of that piece running. So this is before the final kind of chain stitchy outline was applied. And you can see that we've got a lot of nice thick texture here. It looks like we're using big, thick threads. And we also have, you're going to see that there's a center line in this texture that is not actually a proper split. It's something else. We'll show you that in a second. It's a lap. This is actually two pieces. But the other one that I did, the other sample I worked on, actually, for some reason, have not managed to save back my final image with it finished, is this piece. And this was done with, it's the same shapes that were used in the other one, but I had opposing angles on the two columns that made up kind of the backbone of this script text. So once again, we're using these multi-pass or whip stitch satins, and I think it's easier to see what they are here. What you can see is that you've got the bean-like stitch, the multi-pass stitch here, and they're connected with an individual connector stitch as we go back across. And in fact, one of the reasons I didn't like the opposed version of this is that where some of the angles fell, we ended up where we're traveling in such a way that I've got my multi-pass satin here, but then the connector was really visible, and we were getting more visible gaps than I wanted. Some folks, when I showed it to them, really liked the visible gaps, this feather stitch look that ended up happening to it. For me, I really didn't like that as much because what I wanted was something that was fairly solidly filled, that I had full coverage on, but still looked a little more handmade, had some texture to it, looked vintage. And this kind of treatment for me was more what I was looking for. I've got kind of a stem stitch action going here rather than a chain, and I've got this texture that's inside of it that looks kind of hand stitched, that looks like thick thread, but isn't quite as gappy. It isn't quite as unfilled, and it doesn't have quite the opposing herringbone kind of look to it. So that's the sample that we were talking about. I'm also just going to very briefly show you some testing that I did with the whip stitch, and we'll talk about that. But this is what we're dealing with here, is actually taking a letter and carving it apart into multiple sections and then applying this specialty stitch to get that thick stitch look. So let's go ahead and we'll grab the actual file. And you'll have to pardon me while I grab the file. I have so many files open. This is the whip test that we had. This is the two different kinds of whip stitch that we were working with. And some of the inspiration from this actually comes from very different kind of logos. And I think I actually may have a couple of those in this as well. I tried to get those set up to show you, but I may not have them here. All right. I'll just show you the actual logo pieces because I had some issues trying to drag up some images last minute. But the two logos that it made me think of when I was talking about trying to do this treatment, where I wanted to have something that had a little separation in center, originally, I was thinking about using a beveled treatment or something similar, but in a single color. And so I'm going to show you a couple of logos that I really originally started from in my mind. One of them is this Tuaca ski team logo, and this is done as a 2-color bevel. And you can see that there are not only are the colors there to show the beveled edges, but we actually are using the satin stitches themselves to define that bevel. And you can see that I do have the angles are partially opposed, not crazy opposed, but this angle is certainly not the same as the other angle next to it. And that the tops of this, as this looks kind of like chiseled stone, the tops are in a separated satin stitch, same thing on all of the stroke ends, so that we get a difference between the ends of each stroke and the length of the stroke itself in the spine. So this is how I started it. I'll just show you that we've got this multicolor bevel here and that we are lapping on top of it with the second color. So here's the first color down. You can see already that we've got these kind of serif-like ends that are done here, these end stops that are done in another in separate satin stitches. So we've done some carving in the first color. Second color, we've come in and added these bevels. Once again, we're using satin directionality, and where we have areas where they interact, pardon me for zooming out there, areas where they interact, you're going to see how the different directions of the satin and the mitering, both between the different color layers and here as it's mitered in the same color layer, are giving us some definition and making it look like chiseled stone. That's the kind of the attitude that we were looking for. Didn't do it universally, but where we wanted nice dark shadows, which were all on this right-hand side, we tried to go ahead and leave those seams there to give us the nice dark shadows and the texture. And of course, as we go throughout the rest of it, it just continues in that same fashion where we're layering on top. And as you can see, as we're layering this, that we do have a bit of an overlap, of course. There's a small overlap here that's going to just keep these together as far as registration, of course. So that was one of the logos I was thinking of when I wanted to make this. I thought about trying to do some sort of beveled structure like this, but it didn't really fit exactly what I was doing. But I did think, I want to use overlapped satins to get that look of some separation there. And also because I could tune the angles of the two satins. Certainly I started out with that full herringbone opposition, but because of the nature of that multi-pass satin stitch and trying to achieve a target density with it, because we've got multiple passes on individual stitches, I ended up with more gapping than I would like. But the other logo that I was looking at was this quite old logo I did for Hellion Racing. There's another one where you're seeing me define some stuff with negative space or differently with the outlines. But in the initial piece, we have a 3-color bevel that was supposed to look like a chromed letter. So we've got this original darker gray that's in here. Then we're coming back in, the medium gray. We're coming back in with a darker gray. That we're doing that same kind of treatment with our ends. And then at the very end, we're going to go ahead and have the top sides of these bevels where we have a light source that's kind of coming from the top down, and it's going to shine on top of each of these letters. And that actually, I unfortunately don't have the picture sitting there where I can show it to you, I don't believe. But that's something I might show you guys next week. That did actually kind of play into the same idea of this beveled text, right? Same thing with the Tuaca ski team. So I started out with that concept in mind, but I wanted to use whip stitch to do it. And in the case of the initial one, that is kind of what I did. Here's the piece that we're looking at. First thing I'd like to show you is, I think it's interesting, is that the shapes for these two pieces are exactly the same. If I go ahead and drop out my stitches, I have these different shapes. They are exactly the same for both sets, aside from me using another outline for the final back stitching on the outer edge of this piece. So we're using the same shapes to achieve these two things. The only things that are different in the settings on this are the inclinations, are the stitch angles. So these two E's, despite looking very different, it's only the stitch angles that change between the two. The rest of the settings are the same. But let's go ahead and run through a couple of them if we can. We'll just go ahead and grab our draw ribbon here. Let's take a look at it, and you can see that each stroke, we have one half that runs first, and then a second half on top of it. And these are manually separated. This is not me using an automatic tool. I've drawn two halves of each stroke so that I can use them to get that overlapping layering and or the beveling, depending on how we were working on it. In this particular case, especially this top one, I'll zoom in and you'll see that the stitch angles are the same. Let's zoom in on this E here a little bit, and we'll actually see it run. It's a little easier to see because of that angle separation, that we have the first side, and then we have an opposing angle on the second side, though I did travel underneath, then I traveled back across, and I'm using that opposing angle. And these are with whip stitches. And let's zoom in even further on this. And we can zoom in really far on these guys. I'm going to show you the whip stitch in action so you can see what I'm talking about when I talk about multi-pass satin. Let's get up to the section where we are right here, and we're going to watch that indicator move, right? So we have this across, 1, 2, then we go across with 1, 2, 3. And then over. 1, 2, 3, over. And so what we're doing is when we hit that one stitch, we are passing across it multiple times. Now we've got some short stitching here that makes it a little different. So I'm actually going to pull back to a section over here where we can see it a little more clearly. Because what you're going to see is I forgot that I used jaggedness on the top edge because I didn't want to have a clear line. I decided at the end that I didn't want a clear line in the center, so you actually will see that I'm using jaggedness or feathering on the one edge to get it. So let's go back to the initial one that's previous. You can see that it actually has the full width satins in it, and I think it'll be a little easier to see our multi-pass here build up. So let's zoom in on that just a hair, and we'll back up to one of these stitches here that's not done with that roughness involved, and we can see that we have that travel back. We're on this side. We're going to have our actual kind of, we would say our bean, our multi-pass satin. What do we mean? Pass 1, pass 2, pass 3 in the same location with very small offsets. What does that do? It builds up a thick line that looks like thick thread out of a thinner thread. So very much like bean stitches end up looking thick and built, and they look like they're a little wider than they could be, like you're using big, thick floss. The same thing with a multi-pass satin or with a whip stitch. And then we travel back across. So that's the unit we're really looking for. We've got our whip, 3 stitches in this case, and then our travel back. And depending on how you set that, of course, depending on your software and how you set it, in this case, I've got a 3-pass whip. I also have the option for a 5-pass whip, which would then do 5 passes on that same multi-pass stitch with a single stitch over to travel to the other side of the column. So that's what we're looking at with our whip stitch. In construction, though, as you can see, the way this was constructed, fairly easy to kind of take a look at. It's really just me individually splitting. You can see these different pieces that I have here, and I can pull these apart for you. Essentially, I've got this upper piece and this under piece. The first piece is done full width. It does not have any jaggedness applied to it. But this is done in the same satin, the same multi-pass satin as the top piece. However, the top piece does have some jaggedness applied to it because I did want that roughness on the inner edge. I didn't want to have a solid split line. Originally, I started with that solid split line because you guys know I was looking at the pieces like this where I had a bevel in it. But eventually I decided I wanted this rougher look so that it looked like a kind of feathered look, a little bit more hand stitched, and it gave me more of the texture I was looking for. And we can go back to the image of what ended up being the final piece, and you'll be able to see pretty readily that though it feathered together quite nicely, we don't have one solid line. We have just this kind of meandering line within here because of that roughness in the actual satin, in the top satin that was done. So we still have some beveling. As you can see in this particular piece, even with that applied, we're just getting that very herringbone-like texture. It does still look a little straighter because we're having the angle meeting in kind of a certain spot that it continues to meet. That angle there just kind of has this effect of this weird splitting because we have to travel back across here. So the problem I had was once I got into a short enough travel and the angles were just so, I didn't like how the travel went. We had some splitting. Lindsay says, is the whip stitch light enough not to require any underlay? It depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you were trying to achieve a look that was completely filled, if you had to have a completely solid edge that didn't wander at all, you might want to use some underlay. Or you can also do, like I said, my edge was different because I went ahead and ran an edge on top. I ran a stitch to define the edge, and that, because it had some thickness, was taking up some of that issue. You could still use a kind of underlay if you wanted to. There's multiple ways you could handle underlay in that case. Because I was doing this piece where I had the two satins laying on top of each other, I certainly didn't want to use automatic underlay on the top satin because it would have made it sit on top and it would have caused more texture in the center. It really depends on the look you're going for. Most of the time when I'm doing whip stitch, I want fabric to show through, and I'm not too concerned about having a little bit of pull and a little bit of roughness because it's supposed to look handmade. It's supposed to look like floss. And in fact, I'm going to show you some tests that were initially done. And the thing that's going to kind of blow you away on these tests were done just to kind of as proof of concept for the initial stuff. And these are the rough test images. These are not my final pieces. But what you're going to notice about them is that we have this massive difference in how rough and how thick all these things look. And I think it's actually a little more interesting in this in the gold sample here. But what you may not get is that it's the same amount of stitch count on the left side as the right side, and it's all, of course, the same thread. So we have this stitch count that's similar, but we have these gaps because of the way that these are gathered together in those whips in those multiple passes. In the case of this piece, also, the other thing that's interesting to notice about this, these are exactly the same drawn shape. I'm going to show you the file in a second. But in the case of these whip stitches, I'm looking for this rough look. I want it to look like somebody has kind of in a very homespun method used thick floss to try and define this, or that it's intentionally weathered, intentionally distressed. And that's usually what this is seen for. The commercial use of these whip stitches, at least so far as I've used them, and lots of my kind of commercial producer friends have used them, is to create vintage applique and vintage treatments with rough distressed applique that look like some of the stitching has either pulled out or that look like it was stitched on by hand from a distance. In that case, we're really exaggerating the texture. And you can see what I've actually done here, and I'll go ahead and pull back to one of the other samples. We have these three pieces done. We have normal satin on the left, we have a 3-pass whip on the center, and then we have a 5-pass whip on the right. And these are done with the same number of stitches per inch, if you take it that way, stitches in a millimeter, so that even though the placement is different, the overall stitch count's the same. And what we're seeing is the difference in what we would consider to be density is due to the grouping of the stitches. And certainly you could use underlay to get more coverage. But in this case, I also used some roughness, some feathering on this because I wanted to see what you could get out of the same lettering. So if I applied the same technique. So in this case, I used the whip stitch and then I used the feathering, the roughness, the jaggedness on the edge. I could use a standard stock letter, a standard set of the same vectors or the same embroidery objects to create both a super, super clean, normal satin stitch here. This is straight out of a keyboard font that I created, or this kind of rough vintage look. So could you use underlay on it? Yes, you absolutely can. It depends on whether or not you want to see the underlay. If you're looking at a piece like this where we have these large gaps, the underlay will most certainly be visible if you have like an edge run underlay under this. And if you want to make a super clean edge on it, you might use an edge run or a contour to capture that edge somewhat. But what I would say is most of the time when I'm using a whip like this, I don't want it because I want some show through. I'm looking for the dramatic edges on this. I'm looking for this kind of big, heavy stitch look. And I adjusted the density in these particular pieces. They're not the same density setting. They're the same stitch count. So I actually used different density settings to achieve the same stitch count. So I had roughly the same number of stitches in each of these samples. So like I said, it depends on the look that you're looking for. It depends on what you're trying to actually end up with. And hopefully, let me try and show you that. I'm going to show you the whip test as well. So this is that whip test. And as you can see in this case, because we can't see thickness building up in the digital version, it's not going to show us the multiple pieces that lay directly on top of each other rolling off the way we see them roll off in the actual piece. We're not going to see all of that whip stitch in this. But what you are going to see is how it's constructed. And the first thing to show you is, let's go ahead into the actual digitizing view. If I turn off the stitches, those are all three identical sets of outlines. Nothing is different about them aside from the settings and the stitches themselves. So that's the first thing to notice about it. And the reason why I kind of say that and keep pumping that up is that this is a way to take a shape and with settings alone, with stitch type alone, make a very different look, a very different definition to the final piece. So let's go ahead and run it through just so you can see it. Obviously, standard satins are standard satins. These ones don't have a bunch of underlay because I was trying to compare apples to apples. I didn't want underlay to change how the final show through, the final coverage was there, or how the edge looked. So standard, only with traveling and nothing else. So there's your standard. We go to that 3-pass. You can start to see how in the 3-pass we get across, get the multiple passes, then the one return. And then we have, once again, 1, 2, 3, one return. So that's how that whip is going to continue to work. It has some roughness involved because of the feathering settings. And then once we get to the last one, you'll see we have those 5 passes. And because I was going for the same stitch count, you can see that I made the density much lower between each of these passes, the spacing between each of these 5-pass hits quite a bit wider. And you can also see that we do see that travel stitch. Now, I'll go back to the sample. You can see how much you actually see it comparatively and how much this density builds up. Look how far apart those are, right? But we're then going to drop 5 stitches. So we've done that travel across, we've done that return, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we're going to jump across the column again. So that's our 5-pass whip, our 5-pass satin. So once we've done that, you can see that's going to keep defining that edge. We do have some jaggedness applied to this. Like I said, we've got some feathering applied to it. In fact, if I look at the piece right now, I can go ahead and see my feathering, and I've got 30% feathering and extension on either side of these guys. So on the left and the right, we have 20% on the 3-pass, and then of course 0 feathering on the normal satin stitch. But you can see here are these 3 pieces. As we're looking at this particular piece, the one thing to once again bring up is how far apart those repeats are. As you can see, if I go ahead and grab a measuring tool, between these kind of repeats from edge to edge, we've got a gap that is significant. We're looking at over 1 millimeter, 1.2 millimeters. But let's go back to the actual image of them. If you look at this, there is definitely not 1 millimeter of daylight between these two. We do see the return, especially depending on the thread. This is a spun polyester thread, so the fuzziness and that thickness of that thread means we're not seeing the return nearly as much. We're not seeing that between. We do see it more on these threads. This is a rayon up here, and we can certainly see the return in this one. But you can see as those stitches build up, you are most definitely not getting a full millimeter of daylight between those passes. And the same thing over here. It's definitely not a full millimeter 1.2 or more like it is over here on the 5-pass. But over here on the 3-pass, there are significant gaps in the actual file. But these significant gaps in the file don't account for what we're actually seeing in the piece. Yes, there are significant gaps. Let's go ahead and go back here. We'll grab our measuring tool one more time. We'll go ahead and look at this gap between here, and we are 0.7, 0.8. Definitely enough to see between 2 elements usually, but because we're building up the stitches, as they build up and roll off of each other, we have coverage in here. And I would actually argue fairly thick coverage. Of course, the place where the coverage is going to break down, and intentionally so, is at the edges where the stitches are all stacking up together at penetration points that are very close together. Because of the way that's done, we're definitely still going to get this rough kind of humped edge to the outside edge of these things. And even if we look at the E here, before it's finished, even on the piece where we don't have the opposing angles, and especially on the piece of the opposing angles, we're going to see, even in kind of I would consider these straightaways here, we're still going to see some of that kind of lumping, that kind of thick stitch look, because as we drop them all into the same very close penetration point, it's going to look like we're bringing one multi-strand piece of floss up from that same spot. So like I said, it's interesting in that the way we're producing this texture is actually quite simple. It's not something that requires a lot of extra work. It absolutely doesn't in the digitizing phase, because truthfully, like I said, if I turn off those stitches, these are identical. All of that texture in this particular piece is bought through the use of the settings. There's nothing else to it that causes that to happen. So the whip stitch is making all of that cool texture happen. Certainly, as we can see, it's hard to use 3D. 3D view is not going to help us that much in this particular piece, because it's going to roll off in a way that's only going to be seen in the thread. But we get that look without having to change our shapes. Whereas, admittedly, as people were looking at the piece that I did, the final piece that I did in the kind of whip stitch script E, in that piece, there is absolutely some digitizing to be done. If we want, especially on the piece that has the angles involved, we can see how we've got stitch angles that are opposing between the different sides. These ones are all kind of leaning in. These lean in toward the center piece as well from the other side. So if you could see the inclinations together, they make little arrowheads that point down into the stroke. Well, that certainly only is going to happen having multiple angles when we have these two columns that are carved out separately, and that requires me to draw two different pieces, despite the fact that I have this overall letter that is present here. This is one stroke of the letter that you can certainly identify. It is drawn in two pieces, and to get that kind of, especially the beveled look, especially that herringbone look, that does take digitizing. It's not just a setting. Certainly there are effects you could get that are similar. You could use different stitch types and get closer, but if you want to get exactly that look that I was achieving, you wouldn't have that. Now, certainly, if you're looking at the one where the stitch angles are similar, there is some density that's built up in the center, but this could also be probably had very similarly with splitting, with length limiting, and probably would still look similar. I wanted to build up a little more density in the center and have it raise up a bit. And in that case, I found that using two satins and splitting them gave me a nice little center ridge, a nice little hump in the center, so that I had some texture involved. And I didn't end up having, as you can see here, you actually have a pretty decent amount of coverage here. Yes, you can see the penetration points because they're thick, and we really are hitting that needle in the same spot pretty frequently or close to it. So they do spread apart the underlying piece, but because we have a little bit of overlap here, I didn't have a big dark line in the center where the penetration points from both sides of this, or let's say I had done some sort of splitting in the satin. Often when it goes down to the fabric, you'll get a really deep shadow. You'll see a little bit of the fabric as the thread goes down into that central penetration point. And I actually wanted more coverage than that. Despite the fact that I did want kind of a looser look to it, you can see from any distance, despite the fact that we've got maybe a couple little artifacts due to stitch angle, you don't have a tremendous amount of dark show through in the center like you might have with a split stitch. So those are reasons why I decided to use an overlap in my piece. And also, though I wasn't fond of the look and didn't go with it for the final piece, lots of people really liked this kind of herringbone opposed angle setup, and I just wanted to make sure they understood how it was achieved. And in this case, once again, it is achieved by drawing two different satin columns to create each stroke, overlapping them slightly, and in this case, opposing our stitch angles. On one side, we're heading in and we're using an opposing angle on the other side so that our stitches don't line up, and we end up with both some reinforcement as they lay on top of each other, and we end up with that kind of opposing herringbone look, that texture. So really, it depends on what you want to get to. Can you use underlay with this? You could, to get increased coverage. I think on this piece, I could have used some manual kind of contouring underlay. I would use a column that has contour fill. If you don't know a contour fill, it runs parallel lines inside of your satin column. I could have drawn a third column that had those parallel lines inside of it, and it would have allowed me to have essentially perpendicular underlay to the top stitching anywhere it landed. that's something that you could certainly do to get more coverage. You could use traditional underlays, just a zig with maybe a contour or edge run. The only problem with that would be if you're using this feathered edge inside of the top of this, or if you don't want to have the secondary piece of your bevel stand up too high or have a large lip on it, you might not want a contour edge right on the inside of it. But I do imagine doing what is almost like a global underlay per stroke, where I would draw a satin stitch that is in the shape just inside of this overall stroke and use a contour fill. And if you guys aren't familiar with that, again, let me go ahead and actually pull up the software so I can show you what I'm talking about with that. I'm not going to draw out the entire thing, but I can grab one of these satins and show you what I mean by a contour. We have a couple different availabilities, especially in Brilliance. We've got a couple different kinds that we can use, but let me just grab one of the lower satins that has all of the edges set normally, and we'll go ahead and change the settings so I can tell you what I'm talking about. In this case, we're using a contour 1. This is contour 1 in our software. There's different kinds of contours in different softwares depending on your contour fill. In this case, it uses the same amount of lines of stitching at any point. What it does mean is you have more coverage in thinner areas than thicker. You will see these used for flower petals and other things that are used to make that kind of thick and thin, light and dark color coverage happen artistically. But the other kind you can use is contour 2. Contour 2, now I would actually change my density on contour 2 so you can see it a little bit better. I'm going to use a much looser density on this. What it does is achieve a density by using as many lines as it needs in any given section to achieve the density you set. This would probably be a little more reasonable to use as a global underlay for a column. What you can imagine, and I'll just kind of show you what I'm talking about, if I used then another satin on top of it, and I'll just use a normal satin, or maybe I can use let's go ahead and do a 3-pass whip, and we'll go ahead and really pump up that density so you can see what I'm talking about. If we were trying to get some coverage, we could actually layer these on top of each other. In this case, I'll actually remove it has no underlay on it. I will go ahead and comp that up a little bit so that we end up with some overhang. So let's imagine that we're doing our whip stitch and we want to have some sort of underlay to provide more color coverage. You can see that this column underneath it that I just used, right? If I grab this guy, we'll go ahead and see where our second one is here. Okay, that's 2-6. So let's say we're looking at this piece, and this underneath is our contour 2. We can change our density on that contour 2, and as you can see over here in the edge, we're getting more and less coverage, and we can get tighter underlay that is now going to give us some color coverage and hold up that stitching on top of it. And you can see how at any given point, we actually have essentially perpendicular underlay under this whip stitch. And what I'm going to tell you actually is I've used this technique many times, drawing my own column and using it as underlay under other sorts of split satin stitches where we get too much show through, where we see too much of the garment underneath it. Certainly it doesn't have to be the whip. We can say, we have this whip here. If I just do a normal piece and I'm doing, say, a length limit, so I have some breakup that's going to happen. You see how I've got texture in here, very much like a fill. What I will often do for really large lettering that I want to still look satiny but not have super long stitches is to set my length and have an edge pad that's pretty big, closer to half. So we have a very satin-like edge, but as you can see in the center, I'm still having this texture. It's still breaking up as expected, as intended. It's going to break this up and have a fill-like texture in here. Sometimes if I use a zigzag or another kind of standard satin stitch type underlay, you might not get the kind of coverage you want, especially if you have a lot of stitches lining up where you're getting like a direct split. And what I would like to do for that, especially if I'm getting it kind of looser, if I'm working to have a looser density, and I'll go ahead and pump the density a little looser on this one so you can see it, I'm using that stitch, I'm using that contour to provide that. Now, certainly I would draw it a little narrower here. And once again, let me up that comp so you can see it very much more like what I would do. You'll see that that contour underlay is essentially serving up multiple rails for each of these stitches to land on. And because if I turn on my stitch penetrations, you'll see that I've got individual little stitches in here because of that length limited or auto split satin, whatever your software calls it. No matter where these stitches are, I will generally have 2 to 3 rails of, I'm calling them rails, 2 to 3 lines of this contour satin or the contour column fill. in order to act as an underlay. So it's a nice way to do a manual underlay if you are looking for that color coverage and if you're having issues with splitting that you can see through. And that no matter what way you're doing it, if you're using your own carved splits, if you're using a normal split satin, you're actually telling it, I want 2 splits in this particular satin, or if you're using a length limit like this, certainly, like I said, length limit is a good reason to do it. Auto splits are a good reason to do it, especially on really wide ones. But let's say we were just doing a split column and you're seeing a little bit too much color in there. I find that sometimes using something like this can lift it up a bit. It's not as much for this. I would say it's a lot more useful for me in length limit. And certainly if you wanted to see the underlay, because in the lightest spots, if you're doing one of these like 5-pass whips and you did like I did, where you're going to have, you're going to have the 5-pass whip, you're going to have some pull comp on it. And let's say we're going to go ahead and really drop that density down so that we get a nice jagged edge on it. You are absolutely going to see some of that contour through here. But it would provide color coverage if you're trying to just cover more of the background behind it. All right, so I know that was a lot, folks. I know that was a lot to cover, and I know we went all the way from Mascots to that sucker with all the whip stitches and the multiple areas of kind of carving. We dealt with the facets that were in there. All in all, I think that those were all valuable things to look at, certainly, and they were questions that came up this last week. But hopefully those of you who hung out for the entire thing enjoyed it and had something to listen to for a while you're working, if nothing else. What I will leave you with is this. Between the Mascots and the whip stitch pieces that we just talked about, the things that I find the most interesting, the most salient to kind of go back on is to think about your layering. Think about the reveal. So if we have something on top of something else, we can have an overlap that we create that is not intended to be seen. That's just as good for our overall ability to keep our registration on point. And I would definitely think about the idea of the trough. I very much love when I'm trying to lay in an outline and I've got an outer underlay like I showed you, or an outer outline like I showed you, to have it underneath and have that trough where the 2 satins come together. It's a great place to lay in that final outline. Think about your pull compensation when you do that, though. Certainly whatever outline is on top, if we're running a straight stitch along that edge exactly, pull it up a little bit on top of that outline, or make sure that the topmost satin outline before that edge stitch is put it down has a little bit of comp on it, so that we end up at least hitting just where it pulls in. But I think that it's super interesting to think about how these things come together. Remember these things also. You can define areas with negative space. So if we see a super small line, it doesn't mean we have to draw that line. Sometimes we can have a really tiny gap. Remember to leave yourself a little bit of slop if we're on materials that have a tendency to shift a lot. Things like using the reveal, using overlapping can help us maintain, even if we just can't help but having a little bit of shift in our material. That's something that can help us quite a bit. And by the way, certainly go take a look at the features your software has. If you're in Stitch Artist, take a look at that whip, the 3-pass, the 5-pass whip. That's what it's called. It's a stitch type that's on the satin column. If you're in other software, you may see a box in your satins that will tell you how many passes or how much count there is. And that count is a very similar kind of thing. It's multiplying that 1 stitch across and dropping it in that same trough. So we end up with that bean-like stitch. And no matter what thing I cover, I think it's always worth kind of bringing home the concept that the shapes that are in our art are not necessarily the shapes we need to draw or the shapes that we're going to fill with stitches to get our final look. So if you do nothing else this week, divorce from your mind the concept of the shapes that come in, especially if they're vector, double if they're vector, but the shapes that are in your art. Realize immediately that those shapes are not the final edge you are necessarily going to draw to get your effect. Also, that the shapes you draw don't necessarily have to limit the quality of your edge or your stitching. You don't necessarily have to get a rough edge by using the shape to make that edge rough. And think about that kind of synergy between these things. How do the settings and the shapes I draw come together to define what my final look is, what my final texture is? And if there's one last point, realize that just because an underlay doesn't exist as a manual checkbox doesn't mean you can't draw it with straight stitches, create it with a different kind of column or fill, or make an underlay that goes over multiple objects, global underlays or regional underlays, if you call them that will go under multiple top stitching objects in order to support them. Underlay is supportive stitching, not a setting. So in any case, make some cool stuff. Show me your cool stuff. Send me some links. Tag me on them. And I would love to see what you guys come up with next week. If you have questions, you have a type of work that you've been trying to do that's bothering you, you have something that you want to hear more about, find me on social media. Type in Eric Campbell, ERIC, with that weird little H on it, and you will find me all over the place. And hit me up. Comment here if you're listening after the fact, if you're listening to the replay. Comment here anyway, and I know the people here like to answer questions, and I know I certainly do. But until next week, I cannot wait to see what you create.